So when we looked at the timeline, I briefly showed you how to make keyframes to create animation, and the different interpolations or easing settings you can apply, and how that translates to the motion graph view. In this video, we're going to take a closer look at how the different easing settings affect the look and feel of your motion. So I'm just going to quickly set up 2 keyframes of this circle moving across the screen. And I'll do the same for this bottom one. I'll turn on channel visibility for ball 1 so I can match the timing. Now I'm just going to right click on the first keyframe and make sure they're set to linear. And you can see by the spacing of the points on the motion path that it's going to move the same distance between every frame, which looks like this. Then let's set this bottom one to smooth. And now you can see by the motion path that the rate of change over the course of the path starts a little slower, gets faster, and then slows down again. And if we play, you can see that the smooth version looks a little more natural. Now if we switch to the motion graph, we can get a picture of the difference. So this is the graph for the linear version, and this is the smooth version. So the graph starts horizontally, gradually gets steeper, indicating faster motion, and levels out again, indicating it's slowing down. So let's compare this to the other interpolations. Now they make it hard to select keyframes from this view, but what we can do is go to Window, Keyframe, and we get this new panel. You might want to have this panel undocked so you don't lose so much width on your timeline. And then, as long as I select a keyframe on a channel, I can move between the keyframes on that same channel using these buttons. And I can change their interpolation choice with this drop-down. And down here, I can also give it a hold duration, so it will hold the keyframe position for this number of frames before starting the transition to the next keyframe. And you can set an interval, which in a sense is like changing the frame rate, but just for this keyframe. So you can see on the motion path, if I set it to interval 2, then we get half as many positions because it's only going to update the position every other frame. In traditional animation, we'd call this animating on 2s because we hold each drawing for 2 frames. And you can see when it's played, it's slightly less smooth than it was on 1s. I'm just going to set the interval back to 1. You can also set it to stagger, which basically makes it invert the position of every other keyframe and gives this sort of vibration effect to the animation. There's only very specific cases where you might want to use that. And lastly, you can label a keyframe with a color if you want, though you can only see that on the channel view. Now let's look at some of the other interpolation types. So right now we're on smooth, which gives us this gentle S-curve. The next one we haven't seen is ease in out, and by the graph you can see this is basically a more extreme version of smooth. Then there's ease in, which has the slower acceleration curve at the start and the faster one at the end. And then ease out is the other way. Then Bezier lets you control the curves manually using Bezier handles. We'll look at that later in the next video. Whoops, gotta reselect my keyframe. Then there's step, which basically means no interpolation. It will just hold the one pose until the next keyframe. You may want to use this as the default when you start animating a character to just time out the key poses. Then there's noisy, which just adds a bunch of randomness to your interpolation. You can change the amount here with these settings if you want. Next, there's cycle. Now this is a really useful one. This lets you repeat the animation between a series of keyframes indefinitely. We wouldn't actually want to do this on frame 1, so let's set this back to smooth, and then come out to the end keyframe and set that to cycle. Then if I extend our movie length, we can see that the animation will cycle indefinitely until we add additional keyframes down the line. And in the channel view here, you can see it indicates the cycle with this backward arrow, and this orange arrow on top going back to the start of the cycle. Now to define where it cycles back to, you can either specify an absolute frame number, in this case 1. The disadvantage of this is that if we move the keyframes of the cycle later in the timeline, it's still trying to cycle back to frame 1 instead of our first keyframe. You could alternatively tell the cycle to move back a certain number of frames relative to this keyframe. Then we can move the frames around, but now the disadvantage is if you try to change the time between the keyframes, it will throw off the cycle. So you just have to go on a case-by-case basis and decide which is best. Also, if you put a number for the hold duration, it will hold for that many frames before cycling. You can see that on the motion graph here. But notice it only holds once, not every cycle. Then there's a really cool feature we can enable here and make this an additive cycle. This means it will cycle, but add the relative change in distance each cycle. With this on, you can see up here, now when the ball cycles, it keeps going from the spot where it ended the previous cycle. Let me shorten the distance so we can see more cycles. So that's a really handy tool for doing things like walk cycles, where the character moves across the screen. Our last two interpolation types are bounce and elastic. These will automatically create some common effects you might need. First, there's bounce. You can see this gives us a much more advanced curve where we accelerate to our end position value, then bounce back, and do that 2 more times, which gives us the effect of bouncing. You can specify the number of bounces and the scale or height of each bounce in the keyframe palette. Just make sure you have enough total frames for all the bounces to play out, or the bounces at the end will get really choppy. Elastic is similar, except it will overshoot your target end position and spring back and forth before settling into the end keyframe. Or you can make it backwards and it will spring back and forth in anticipation before the final jump to the last keyframe. Now, it's important to keep in mind that you can apply these interpolation types to any property, not just the layer position like we've been doing. Here I've got elastic applied to a scale change and bounce applied to a rotation change. This is an easy way to add some follow-through to animations without having to add a bunch of keyframes. So as useful as the preset interpolation types are, you really want to master controlling your easing by hand using the motion graph. We'll look at how we do that in the next lesson. I'll see you there.